Deion Sanders walked into Cleveland Browns training camp on day 2, and the local media acted like someone pulled the fire alarm in a building that wasn't even on fire. Cameras everywhere, beat reporters scrambling, the narrative machine spinning at full speed before the man even reached the sideline. And then Todd Monken opened his mouth and made every single one of those panic merchants look absolutely foolish. What actually happened in Berea that day, what it means for Shedeur Sanders going forward, and why the people who have been screaming distraction for months just ran completely out of ammunition, that is exactly what we are getting into right now. Because here is the thing, this was not just a training camp visit. This was a moment that exposed something much deeper about the Cleveland Browns organization, about the media covering it, and about the fundamental difference between what this team looks like now versus what it looked like before. There are 4 angles to this story that every single Browns fan and NFL fan needs to understand. The media's reaction versus what actually happened, what Deion's presence physically being on the sideline tells us about Shedeur's situation on this roster, the Monken versus Stefanski conversation that keeps getting clearer every single day of camp, and what the people who are actually on the ground in Berea are saying about these early practices, because the vibe has shifted in a way that the highlight clips alone cannot capture. We are covering all of it. Let's get into it. So let's start with what actually went down on day 2 of Browns training camp. Because if you were only getting your information from the Cleveland media, you would have thought a Category 5 hurricane had just made landfall in Berea, Ohio. The reality was something completely different. Deion Sanders showed up, beat reporter Jeff Shedur approached him and asked if he would do an interview. Coach Prime looked at him and said, "I'm not doing media, I'm just here to watch." And that was it. That was the entire statement. Not a press conference, not a sideline takeover, not a locker room speech, just a father who happens to be one of the greatest athletes in the history of American sports showing up to watch his son work. What followed was about as dramatic as a Tuesday afternoon. Deion chatted with Todd Monken on the sideline, Shedeur Sanders got his reps in, wide receiver Tyler Wallace and cornerback turned receiver Denzel Boston stayed after to put in extra work, and then everybody went home. That is the complete and total story of what happened. No locker room chaos, no closed-door emergency meetings, no anonymous sources leaking tension to beat writers, nothing. The Cleveland media had every camera angle you could possibly dream up. Deion sitting, Deion standing, Deion existing near a football field. And with all of that footage, with all of those cameras rolling, they could not find a single second of actual controversy because there was genuinely none to find. The building was not on fire. There was no fire. There was not even smoke. But here's what's interesting about that. The absence of drama was itself the story. Because the narrative that had been building for months that Deion Sanders anywhere near a Cleveland facility would be some kind of destabilizing event just evaporated in real time on a Tuesday afternoon in Northeast Ohio. And when a narrative that has been pushed that hard collapses that completely and that quickly, it tells you something important. It tells you the narrative was never grounded in reality to begin with. But before we get into the people who built that narrative and what they owe everyone now, let's talk about the man whose reaction made this entire conversation unnecessary from the jump. Todd Monken saw Deion Sanders walk into his building, and his reaction was genuine, immediate, and completely uncomplicated. He was starstruck. He said, and these are essentially his words, "I was a Deion Sanders fan. You kidding me?" That is it. That is the whole emotional response from the head coach of the Cleveland Browns when one of the greatest football players to ever live showed up to watch practice. Not concern, not defensiveness, not a carefully worded statement about maintaining focus and professionalism, just honest human excitement from a football coach who loves football and recognizes greatness when it walks through the door.
And I want you to really sit with that for a second. Because that reaction is not as simple as it looks on the surface. What Monken did in that moment was demonstrate something that cannot be faked and cannot be coached into someone who does not already have it. He showed that he is completely secure in who he is and what he is doing. A head coach who is rattled by outside noise, who is worried about optics, who is spending mental energy managing narratives instead of managing his football team. That coach does not react to Deion Sanders with genuine excitement. That coach calls a staff meeting. That coach sends someone to manage the interaction. That coach finds a way to make it weird. Monken did none of that. He walked over, had a conversation with a legend, and got back to coaching his football team. And that single moment told you more about the culture shift happening in Berea than any press conference ever could. Think about what the old version of this looked like. Think about what happens when a head coach is operating from a place of insecurity, when the outside noise gets in, when the media narrative starts to feel more real than the work happening on the practice field. You get closed-door meetings about optics, you get anonymous sources, you get statements that are carefully designed to say nothing while simultaneously feeding the very drama the coach is supposedly trying to avoid. None of that happened under Todd Monken. Zero. Because Monken is not coaching to manage a narrative, he is coaching to win football games. And that difference, that fundamental difference in mentality, is everything. But it is the people who built the opposite narrative who we need to address directly, because they do not get to just quietly move on from this. The Cleveland media spent months setting up a story. The story went like this: Deion Sanders is a problem. His proximity to the Browns organization, to his son's career, to the facility in Berea is going to create instability. The locker room is going to fracture. Players are going to resent the attention. The coaching staff is going to be undermined. That was the narrative. That was what was being sold to Browns fans as analysis, and the people selling it were not doing it casually. They were doing it repeatedly, with conviction, with sourcing, with the full weight of their platforms behind it. And then Deion Sanders showed up on day 2 of training camp. He watched practice, he talked to the coach, his son ran routes, some receivers stayed late to get extra work in, and then everybody went home. That is what happened. That is what the months of panic merchant content was building toward, a Tuesday afternoon where absolutely nothing went wrong. The cameras caught every second of it and came back empty, not because they were not looking hard enough, because there was genuinely nothing there to find. The drama did not exist. It never existed. It was manufactured from the start by people who either did not understand what they were covering or understood it perfectly and chose to frame it in the most inflammatory way possible anyway. And here's what that means going forward. Every time someone in the Cleveland media wants to bring up Deion Sanders as a distraction, every time someone wants to frame Shedur's family as a destabilizing force, this training camp visit is the receipt. This is the evidence. This is what actually happened when the theory got tested against reality, and reality won by a landslide. A Hall of Famer came to watch his son practice, a head coach was excited to meet a legend, players put in extra work, the locker room did not fall apart, the panic merchants got absolutely nothing, and they're going to have to sit with that for the rest of this season. But what does Deion actually being there mean for Shedur specifically? Because that is the deeper question that most of the coverage completely missed. Here's what the Cleveland media keeps getting wrong about Deion Sanders. They keep treating him like he's some kind of outsider, like he's a celebrity dad who wandered into a professional football operation and doesn't really belong there. And that framing is so disconnected from reality that it's almost hard to know where to push back. This is not just Shedeur Sanders' father. This is Deion Sanders, primetime, one of the greatest athletes in the history of American sports. 14 years in the NFL, 2 Super Bowl rings, a Hall of Fame jacket, and years spent coaching at the highest levels of college football, building programs, developing quarterbacks, working with NFL-caliber talent every single day. His football knowledge is not casual. His connections inside this league are not superficial. His understanding of what it takes to survive and thrive at the professional level is deeper than almost anyone who has never played the game at his level.
So when Deion Sanders walks into that Browns facility, he is not walking into a room full of strangers who have to figure out who he is. He is walking into a room full of people who grew up watching him play, who respect what he accomplished, who understand what he represents in the history of this game. Tyler Wallace, a veteran receiver who has a strong relationship with Todd Monken, also has history with Deion Sanders. These connections exist all across that building. And when someone with that kind of credibility and that kind of reach looks at a coaching staff, looks at a front office, looks at the overall direction of an organization and decides, I trust these people with my son, that is information. That is real, meaningful information about what is actually happening inside that facility. Because Deion Sanders does not stamp people and organizations that he does not believe in. He is not casual with his endorsement. He has too much at stake and too much self-awareness to put his name and his credibility behind something he has doubts about. He stamped Todd Monken. He stamped Andrew Berry. And then he showed up on day 2 of training camp and had a conversation with the head coach on the sideline. Not to take over, not to insert himself into the operation, just to watch his son work in an environment that he clearly feels good about. That is the signal most people completely missed, and it connects directly to the conversation about what kind of coach Todd Monken actually is versus what Cleveland was dealing with before. The comparison between Todd Monken and Kevin Stefanski keeps coming up because it keeps being relevant. And I want to be careful here, because this is not just about how Stefanski handled Shedeur Sanders during the draft process or in the early days of his tenure. This is a bigger conversation about coaching philosophy, about what a head coach prioritizes when he walks into the building every morning, and about what happens to a team's culture when those priorities are off. The Deion Sanders training camp visit just gave us the clearest possible illustration of that contrast, and it is worth walking through carefully. Under the old regime, a visit like this would have been treated like a crisis. That is not speculation. That is based on the pattern of behavior that defined that era in Berea. The instinct was always to manage perception first and coach second. When something happened that had the potential to generate outside attention, the response was defensive. It was insular. It was designed to minimize the story rather than to just ignore it and keep working. And what that approach actually does over time is make the story bigger. Because when a coaching staff is visibly reacting to a narrative, the narrative grows. The media can feel the defensiveness in the building, and it affects the locker room culture. And eventually, the results on the field start to reflect a team that has been spending too much mental energy on everything except football. What Todd Monken is doing is the complete opposite of that. From the very first day of OTAs through the first 2 days of training camp, the message coming out of Berea has been consistent and clear. I am a football coach. I coach football. Everything else is background noise. Deion Sanders shows up? Great. Legendary player. Love to have him around. Let's get back to work. The media wants to manufacture drama? Not my problem. Social media is running with a narrative? I do not have time for that. Win football games, everything else takes care of itself. That is the mentality. And it's not just talk, it is being demonstrated in real time on the practice field every single day. And the people who are actually in Berea watching it happen are starting to describe what they are seeing in ways that should genuinely excite Browns fans. Here is what the early reports from inside Browns training camp are actually saying, and this is the part of the story that deserves way more attention than the Deion visit manufactured drama. The people on the ground in Berea, the ones who are watching these practices with their own eyes, are describing something that has not been seen in that facility in a very long time. Focused, intentional, coaches actually coaching, players being coached hard from day one instead of easing into things like it's the first week of a college semester where nothing counts yet. The specific thing that keeps coming up is the intensity level, not the kind of manufactured intensity where everyone is loud and running around and it looks good for the cameras. Real intensity, attention to detail, coaches correcting things in real time, and players responding to it. The kind of practice environment where you can tell just by watching that the people in charge know exactly what they are doing and exactly what they want. That description, a real NFL operation feel from day one, is not a small thing. That is a massive departure from what was being described about this team just a year ago. And for Shedeur Sanders specifically, the significance of that environment cannot be overstated.
Because here is what happens to a young quarterback when he walks into a well-run operation versus a poorly run one. In a poorly run operation, the outside noise gets in. The media narratives start to feel real inside the building because the coaching staff is reacting to them. The young quarterback picks up on the uncertainty, and it affects his development. In a well-run operation, none of that reaches him. The coaching staff filters it out before it even gets close. The young quarterback just shows up, gets coached hard, puts in his reps, and develops.
The environment does the work that no individual talent or work ethic can do on its own. That is what Shedeur Sanders is walking into right now. That is what the early reports from Berea are describing. And the people who spent months warning about the toxic chaos that was supposedly coming, they are running out of ways to explain why the chaos never arrived. Let me address something directly because it keeps coming up in the comments, and it deserves a straight answer. The argument that Shedeur Sanders is too much of a distraction to be a successful backup quarterback in the NFL. The argument that his father's profile, the media attention around the Sanders family, the overall circus of it all, makes it impossible for a team to function normally around him. That is the argument. Here is the response. Shedeur Sanders is a distraction to lazy coaches, full stop. He is a distraction to coaches who have not figured out that their only job is to put the best possible product on the field and let everything else sort itself out. Todd Monken is not that coach. The proof is not theoretical. It is not based on projections or optimistic assumptions. It is sitting right there in what happened on day 2 of Brown's training camp. Coach Prime showed up, the media swarmed. Every camera in Northeast Ohio was pointed at that sideline, and Todd Monken talked to a legend, appreciated the moment for what it was, and got back to coaching football. No emergency meeting, no defensive statement, no anonymous source telling beat writers about locker room discomfort, just a football coach doing his job in the presence of one of the greatest football players who ever lived. And that is what this entire conversation has been missing from the beginning. The question was never whether Shedeur Sanders brings attention. Of course he does. The question was always whether the coaching staff could handle that attention without letting it become a problem. And the answer, demonstrated clearly and publicly on the practice field in Berea, is yes. Absolutely yes, without question. And here's the thing that makes this even more significant. The people who have been loudest about the distraction narrative were operating on an assumption that was never stated out loud, but was always underneath everything they were saying. The assumption was that whatever head coach ended up with Shedeur Sanders would be weak enough to let the noise in, would be insecure enough to start managing narratives instead of football games, would eventually crack under the weight of the attention and create the very chaos the narrative was predicting. What they did not count on, what they genuinely did not anticipate, was Todd Monken. And now they're stuck, because the chaos never came, the locker room never fell apart, the distraction never materialized. All that's left is a Hall of Fame father watching his son practice and a head coach who was genuinely glad to meet him.
Here is where everything comes together. Deion Sanders does not go places where he does not feel respected. That is not a small character detail. That is a defining principle of how he moves through the world and through football. He has enough credibility, enough history, enough options to be selective about where he puts his time, his energy, and his endorsement. When he shows up at a facility, when he has a genuine conversation with a head coach on the sideline, when he watches practice and does not feel the need to make it about himself or his opinions or his brand, that is him saying something. That is him communicating without a single word to the media that he believes in what is happening in that building. He stamped Todd Monken. He stamped Andrew Berry. And then he came back to confirm it in person on day 2 of training camp. And the head coach was starstruck. Genuinely, honestly, completely starstruck by a Hall of Famer who showed up to watch practice. That is a healthy organization. That is what it looks like from the inside when a franchise is moving in a real direction, not just talking about moving in a direction, not just releasing statements about culture and commitment and all the language that organizations use when they want to sound like they are changing without actually changing. The real thing, the actual version of a program on the rise. Shedeur Sanders is right in the middle of it, putting in his reps, working with Tyler Wallace and Denzel Boston and Taylor Green, doing everything that a young quarterback is supposed to be doing at this stage of his development. The haters came to Berea looking for a disaster, and what they found was a father in the stands, a son on the field, a head coach who loves football, and a training camp that looks and feels like a real professional operation for the first time in longer than Browns fans want to admit. That is not a crisis. That is actually kind of a beautiful thing if you let yourself see it clearly. The panic merchants got nothing. Todd Monken got a chance to meet one of his football heroes, and Shedeur Sanders got 2 more days of development in an environment built for him to succeed. The narrative is collapsing in real time, and we still have a full training camp ahead of us, preseason games on the horizon, and a quarterback competition that is far from settled. Every single piece of that conversation is going to run through this channel because we are not done. The Cleveland media wanted chaos. What they are getting instead is accountability. Every bad take, every manufactured crisis, every distraction headline, all of it is on the record. And every day that passes in Berea without the predicted collapse is another day those people have to answer for what they said. We are just getting started, and the receipts are piling up fast.